What's up, friends of YouTube? Derek Van Diest here with Zaandam Music. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the beat Coolin. We're going to see the instruments I used, the mix process, as well as the arrangement. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to start by playing the entire beat one time through. Alright, and that's the beat. So let's look at the instruments used. So I'm going to start off with the pianos, and I'm going to show you guys how I did this. I used a Contact 5 instrument called Urban Legacy XXL, and this is the sample that I found from the preset pack. So for that sample, I didn't want to use that one because it had some layers that I didn't like. So instead, I grabbed the individual layers that were used to create that sound, and I arranged them in a different way, and I'll show you that in a second. But I used things like Rhodes, piano, and things like the strings. And from Group C, I believe I used some pad sounds as well, and the bass sounds. Alright, so I used several of those layers for this beat. Alright, so starting off with the piano, I used one of those layers, the piano layer. I bounced it to a wave file. I then time stretched it, so it was 8 bars, and I time stretched it to 16 bars. Then I transposed it down 6, and I tuned it up 8. And this is the result that I got from that. Alright, and that was the piano that I used. For the Rhodes, I did the same thing. I transposed it down 6, up 8, time stretched it. This is what it sounds like. Alright, and I then included a JD800, and this is from Omnisphere. This is the Crystal Dream Phase keyboard. And this is what it sounds like. Alright, and those are the pianos that I used. So up next we have the pad sounds. And for the first pad, I did the same thing, time stretched it, transposed it. This is what it sounds like. Okay, so that was the first pad. For the choir, I used, from Omnisphere, I used Human Voices, Choir Women Ooze, P. This is what it sounds like. Okay, and I also used a string sample from the same Urban Legacy. This is what it sounds like. Now you can tell, especially on this sample, that I time stretched it, just because of how slow the strings are hitting. Okay, so those are the strings, and then I have something called hybrid strings, which is just the low end part. I didn't know what else to call it, so this is what it sounds like. So it's very subtle. It's very quiet too. So let's see. All right, and those are all the pad sounds. So oh, for hybrid strings, actually, hold on a second here. I did something different with hybrid strings. Yep, I actually used an Omnisphere pads and strings sound from Lush Green Hybrid Strings. So I programmed this one. I did not take it from Urban. So the ones that I took from Urban were pad and strings. The hybrid strings were from Omnisphere and the choir was from Omnisphere. So sorry about that. Alright, so up next we have the effects. We have Rev X. This is from Contact 5. And I used the Pretty Organic setting. This is what it sounds like. Alright, and also I used a riser from the Razer VST, Windy Atonal Pitch Rise. I also changed the rate to 1/8. And this is what the riser sounds like. Okay, and last is the beat tag, which is the one I always use. Zaandam music. Alright, and those are all the effects. So let's move on to the bass. The only bass that I used was the Juggernaut 808s from Contact 5 on the Big Byte preset. This is what the 808 sounds like. Alright, that's the only 808 I used, and that's the only bass sound that I used. For the drums, I have a top end kick and a bottom end kick. So together they sound like this. Just the top. Just the bottom? Together. Alright, so for the kicks I used sample 1 with a Nick Myra kick for the top. For the bottom I used a sample 1 with a Nick Myra kick as well. Alright, for the snare sound I used a sample 1 with a Nick Myra snare. This is what it sounds like. My bad. Alright, for the clap, it's actually a second snare sound. I'm using a sample 1 with Nick Myra snare. So this is what it sounds like. Alright, and next up I have a hi-hat. This is for, I don't remember which pack this is, but it's the hi-hat 17. This is what it sounds like. Alright, and I also used an open hat. And for this one I used a battery, an instance of battery 4. And I only have the hi-hat here on one of the pads. And all I did was tune it. So I have an easier time tuning on this program than I do with sample 1. This is what the hi-hat, the open hat sounds like. Okay. And I have a perk sound as well. This one's a sample 1. I'm using a Nick Myra chirp perk. And this is what it sounds like. Alright, and those are all the drums. This is what it sounds like when all the drums are playing together. All the drum parts. I'm gonna add the bass to it. I'm gonna add the pads, the effects, and then the pianos. Alright, so now I'm gonna get into the arrangement for this beat. So let's start with the intro. Let's get everything easy to see here. Alright, so for the intro, I have two parts. I have it starting off with the piano and the Rhodes together, as well as the pad, the choir, and the hybrid strings. Those are the only instruments playing on the first half. The second half, I introduce the strings, I introduce the Rev X, and then the riser and the beat tag help me transition to the hook. Now in the hook, I introduce all the drums, I introduce the 808, and I drop the Rhodes as well for the first half of the hook. I also drop the strings. Now the strings do not play on either hook, so the strings are only playing during the verses and the intro. The hybrid strings are playing throughout the entire beat, the pads are playing throughout the entire beat, and the choir is playing throughout the entire beat. Okay, now let's hear what the transition sounds like from intro to hook. Alright, so all the energy is right here in the first part and second part of the hook. Alright, so to switch it up, I added this JD800 so that it's not so repetitive. That's why I took the Rhodes off and replaced it. And both hooks are exactly the same, hook 1 and hook 2. Now, coming up to the verse A here, I do a dramatic drop here because I took all the drums off, but I kept the 808 going. And I also took the effects off, so Rev X only plays during the second half of the intro, the first hook, the second hook, and the outro as well. So since there's no effects on the verse part, there's less energy. So here's what it sounds like going from the hook to the first part of the verse. So the first verse, verse A, has basically the whole vibe of the beat. And then verse B, we start introducing the drums, but I don't introduce the hi-hat or the second snare. So it's only the first snare, no hi-hat, just the open hats and the first snare and the kick. When it goes to verse C, we introduce the hi-hat, and then when it goes into the hook, we bring in the second snare. So the second snare does not play on any part of the verse. And the reason I did this was so that it would be faster in the hook sections rather than in the verse. To me, it gives the illusion of more speed when you have two snares or a snare and a clap playing together. Let's see, for the perk as well, the perk is only on the hooks. And yeah, the riser plays in strategical places here to help me transition to the next area. So I'm using it to transition intro to hook, hook to verse, verse A to verse B, verse C to hook, and then hook to outro. The reason I put a riser here from verse A to verse B is because there was going to be a pretty big energy raise here with the drums, and it sounded better with the riser. This is what it sounds like from verse A to verse B. Alright, and as I said before, both hooks are exactly the same. So when we transition from hook to outro, I drop the 808 and all the drums. So it's only the keyboard, the pads, and the effects. So let's hear that transition. Alright, and let's hear the very end because I thought this was interesting. I have the piano playing as well as the Rhodes, and then the reverb kind of ends the beat. So see if you guys can hear that tail end of the reverb here. Alright, and that's basically how I arranged this beat. So up next, let's take a look at the mix process. Alright, let's start with the 808. So my 808 is routed to the bass bus channel, and what I'm using on here is a virtual mix rack. And I've been messing around with Slate Digital a lot more, and I absolutely love Slate Digital. This is what I'm going to be using on all my projects from now on. I have a VCC channel with the USA input here, the USA setting. I have an FG Bomber, and I just learned how to use this, and it's been very helpful for the low end, for increasing the low end. So I messed around with that, and I also have an EQ here, a Brit EQ, and this is a really nice EQ. It's very powerful. Alright, and that's what I did for the 808. Yep, that's it. And that's the 808, so let's go on to the drums. Let's do that next. Alright, so all my drums are on the drum bus channel, as you can see up here. Also, the instruments that I panned are the clap, which is the second snare. I panned it to the left. This is the open hat. I panned the open hat to the left, and I panned the hi-hat to the right. And that's all the panning. So starting with the top kick, let's see here. I have a virtual mix rack with the USA preset. And what I did was I did a standard low cut with FabFilter Pro Q2. And that's it for the top kick. For the bottom kick, I did a high cut. And I also used the same virtual channel. For the snare, let's see, I used a virtual mix rack, same thing. And that's all I did actually for the snare. For the second snare, all I did was put a virtual mix channel here. So that's all I did for those. The hi-hat, all I did was a virtual channel. Yep, all I did was a virtual channel. And for the open hat, all I did was a virtual channel as well. I'm just double checking here. Yeah, virtual channel. Alright, for the perk sound, Also just a virtual channel. And that's it for the drums. So yeah. Let's move on to the pianos. For the piano sound. Alright, so here we go. For the piano sound. First of all my pianos are routed to the instrument bus channel. I had quite a hard time with mixing the piano sounds. Virtual rack looks like. I have a virtual channel. I learned how to use this revival, which is amazing for low end and also for the top end. I used an EQ, and I also did this custom series lift, which I was learning as well, and a compressor. And this took me a long time to get all these settings the way they are, because I had a hard time with that piano. But yeah, it's a learning process. So I used that virtual mix rack. I also used an Ozone 8 imager with the narrow the image preset to narrow the stereo width. Okay, so for the JD800, I used a virtual and also an EQ, and I rose it out quite a bit, so I EQ'd this Rhodes a lot. Or it's not a Rhodes, it's the JD800. So the Rhodes now, I'm using a virtual mix rack with an EQ and compressor. And for the Rhodes, I have it routed to that Echo Boy, and I'll show you that later on. Echo Boy and also a Pan Man, so it's routed to both Echo Boy and Pan Man. It's using Ozone 8 Imager Enhanced Space preset. And that's all I did for the Rhodes. So those are the pianos, and let's move on to the pads now. All the pads are on the pads bus channel. The first pad sound has a virtual channel. I EQ'd it a lot, all the way max on all of them. And I also did some compression. That was the pad sound. Now we're on the choir. For the choir, I used a virtual channel. I did some EQing and some compression. For the string sound, I did a virtual channel, I used revival, and also some EQ. Okay, and the hybrid strings now. For the hybrid strings, I had to mess around with quite a bit too. Virtual channel, revival, I used a bomber for the low end, and also an EQ. Yep, and those are all the pads. Now for the effects, I have them all routed to the effects bus channel. The Rev X, all I'm using on there is a virtual mix rack with revival as well as an EQ. Alright, and for the riser, I'm using a virtual mix channel and a revival. For the beat tag, I'm using a virtual mix channel as well as an auto tune in D flat minor so that it stays with the key of the beat. 20 retune, 90 humanize. Alright, and that's it for all the instruments. Now let's get into the effects. So the first effect I have is a plate reverb, and it's the one I always use, Valhalla Vintage Verb drum plate. For the hall reverb, I'm using Valhalla Vintage Verb Very Nice Hall. For the room reverb, I'm using Altiverb 7, SARM West Studios. Alright, I'm using Pan Man as one of my effects. It's at default, at a faster rate and a bit more smoothing and a lower width. So I also have an Echo Boy with the acoustic chorus preset. Alright, so now moving on to the bus channels. For the bass bus channel, I have a virtual mix rack with the virtual mix bus, and this one is at the Brit 4K. So all those virtual mix channels that you saw on my instruments are going to be routed to the virtual mix bus. So I have one there. Then I also have an Ozone 8 imager, and I have it all the way down to remove all stereo width from the bass so that it's in full mono. Alright, and now for the drum bus channel. I have a virtual mix rack with the same virtual mix bus. I have a plate reverb and a room reverb as well. For the instrument bus channel, I have the virtual mix rack, same settings, and a room reverb. Virtual mix, as well as the room and the hall reverb. For the effects, I have a virtual mix rack with the same settings, and a room reverb. The filter channel I did not use for this project, the filter bypass I did not use, and the mix bus channel I did not use. Here are all the VCAs properly connected to the bus, bass, drums, instrument pads, effects, and the reverb. For the mastering channel, I have Ozonate equalizer with a brick wall at 30 Hz and another brick wall at 18,000 Hz. Then I have a song key with C# minor, which is the key of the beat. And Sample Grabber is a different program. And I think it's everything here. Yep, that's all of it. So I did no automation on this beat at all. And that's it. So that's exactly how I made the beat Coolin. And if you guys like this beat and you want to lease it, or you want to buy exclusive rights, you guys can do that at my website, which is zaandammusic.com. So thank you all for joining me on this episode, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Take care.